Ram, who will
Thank you,
be
Ken.
giving us this exciting talk, fascinating talk about the history, deep history of ontologies going back to ancient India.
Can everyone see the slides, Ken?
Yes, looks great.
Okay. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to present a little bit historical perspective on ontologies. And what normally happens is that if you look at artificial intelligence as such in terms of the evolution, there are several phases. The prehistory, I call it, the beginnings, the early years. Then we have this notion of knowledge is power, and there ontologies played a big role. And there is something about early neural networks during the late 1980s when Jeff Hinton was at Carnegie Mellon, and then he went to and fro to San Diego. He was at a number of places. So, but then some of the early work he did was at Carnegie Mellon. Then we had the silent period where we had Deep Blue, the rise of the robotics, commercialization of AI technologies, and so on. Then you all observed the neural networks which came to the fore, which is the second wave or the second revolution one can call, and is to do with deep learning. Now, what we are seeing right now is what is known as the third wave, or the revolution, which is the symbiosis of neural and knowledge networks. So this is also called neurosymbolic reasoning. And we have, over the past ontology summits, seen several talks on this neurosymbolic computing and how ontologies play a role. And finally, we have this notion of this conscious machine, which you don't know what's going to happen. And people are kind of working on it right now. So what I'm going to do is now talk a little bit about the prehistory. I call it the Paleolithic for whatever reason. And then you have this Neolithic, which is Hume, Russell, Turing, and a number of other philosophers came into talking about knowledge representation and schemes like that. But really, the whole thing got started with the Indian philosophers, which is not much talked in the Western world. So I thought I'll just give you a briefing on what the Indian philosophers thought about not anywhere between 600 BC to 1000 BC. We're not really sure about the numbers, but 600 BC seems to be a fairly good number. That's almost about 200 to 300 years before Aristotle. And Aristotle's logic is the one which is talked about quite a lot. Any case, uh, so if you look at the taxonomy of the ancient Indian philosophy, we have two kinds. One is known as the Astika, the other one is known as Nastika. In the Astika is the Orthodox school, which accepts the authority of the Vedas as divine revelation. But anyway, basically they follow Vedas. The Nastikas don't accept Vedas per se as such as the source of knowledge, and there are several philosophies underneath the Karavaka, Buddhism, and Jainism. On the Astika, we have about six major philosophies: the Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Samkhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. These are the six main philosophies. Now, the issue is that if you look at it carefully, the whole, people kind of tie this with the Hindu religion, but really it's more of a philosophy rather than a religion. Religion came a little bit later, but everything is bound in philosophy. The philosophical people try to tell you what the underlying basis of existence and God and things like that are there later, but that's not the purpose here. The main two, in terms of the Astika, the thing that is the philosophies that are very important to us are the Nyaya and the Vaisheshika philosophies. So if you look on the Nyaya philosophy is a philosophy, I think it's a pioneer in knowledge representation, because they were trying to model the world and how we process the information there, which is inference. Nyaya really focused on the inference, as you can see, where on the left-hand side, you see this paramanas, which are the valid sources of knowledge acquisition. One way of doing that is perception, which is input from direct sensory data. The second one is anumana, which is actually the inference, or either knowledge-based inference or neural network inference, whatever it is. That's a logic engine. Then you have the upamana, which is the analogical reasoning or semantic mapping. And the fourth one is the shabda, which is the one which we get from experts, the verbal testimony. And these are the inferences kind of things. And there are other things which are really ontological in nature. Is the data model. In the data model is the padarthas, which are the categories of predictability, as you saw on the left hand side. And you can see and this basically evolved in the Vaisheshika philosophy, and now they combine both the Nyaya and Vaisheshika because really they're very similar in terms of, while Nyaya focuses on the inference and process, Vaisheshika focuses mostly on the padarthas, which are the categories of realities. So at this stage, what they did was, and then they had in the padarthas, we had this notion of the top level. When people talk about top level ontologies, they have the same thing where they have this notion of the substance, whatever, that is a top level object, and then you have attributes, which are the gunas. Then there are other things in there, which is the substance is the top level thing. Guna is the one which is the quality, and then you have the samanya, which is basically the general, the class. Which I'll talk about it a little bit on a comparison with the normal, with what we have in the current day ontological world. Then we have actions, kavya. I think there is some, in terms of the figure which was generated, the things are not really right on the left hand side, but you can see that on the right hand side, the actual padarthas, the right things are there on the right side. So, by the way, these things are generated by Gemini, so they kind of little bit, it took some liberties, okay, on the padarthas. It's made some mistakes. We need to correct it. I'll correct it and send the corrected slide set later on. Then we have the notion of samavaya, which is really part-whole relationship. They call it inerrance, but it's a part-whole relationship. So that is basically, the right-hand side shows you the categories, which are basically the things that we look in our ontologies, and the left-hand side looks at the inference part of it. Now, Aristotle uses this three-step syllogism, which is the Anumana in the ancient Indian philosophy, and they kind of look at it from a five-step process rather than a single-step process as such. Okay. So the five-step process that they use in terms of the formal query and resolution, one thing is the pratinja, or they call it pratlina here for some reason. That's proposition. Again, there are some errors in this, in the way this Gemini created this thing, and that's actually pratigna. Pratigna is the proposition. So that is the first part. And basically, the idea is that if you see some, let us say, if you see some smoke on a mountain, now the proposition is that the mountain is on fire. So you make a proposition that the mountain is on fire. And the second one is hetu, which provides the observational data or ground for the claim. Like, for example, you say the mountain has fire, maybe because there is smoke. Because as an observer, you see a mountain and you see smoke. So now you came to a some kind of a proposition that the mountain has fire. Okay. So then the third one they do is this called Udaharana, which is an example or explanatory principle. And this kind of provides a general rule and then cites a verifiable example. And that's a kind of a knowledge, stored knowledge base, we can say. So the idea is that, you can have a rule: whenever there is a smoke, there is a fire. And one of the example is like, if you look into your kitchen, in the kitchen, when there is smoke, there is always a fire. So you can say, well, that's a generic rule. Whenever there is smoke, there is fire. Then you the third part is upanya, which is the application. And here you formally apply the general rule to the specific case in question. In this case, you can say the mountain has smoke that is invariably connected with this particular fire. So you make that connection, you apply whatever the concept you had before, and finally you come to a conclusion, which is the nigamana, is actual conclusion, where you say, yeah, the mountain is on fire. So this is the five-step process you follow. This is the three-step of Aristotelian, where you say if A implies B and B implies C, then A implies C, that kind of a thing. Whereas here are 5 stages in there. So if you want to compare with the modern KR schemes, you can say the beige object, which is actually the dravya substance, which is similar to the individual class, and this Visheshisha, which is the particularity, it is basically the instance of the URI. Then you have Samanya, which is the universal, and that's a class, Isa, in the hierarchy. Guna is the quality or the attributes that you have in like in a owl, it's data type property. Similarly, you have the inherence, which is the part-whole kind of relationship. And then you have this karma, which is part of that philosophy I talked about, the padarthas. And karma is really the action or the motion. If you're looking at an object-oriented system, like when you send a message to this particular object, the object reacts in a particular way, or it invokes a function, and that's what this karma is, action and motion, and it's actually the processor function. And they also introduce this new one more terminology called abhaya, which is absence, or the negation part of it. And that's pretty difficult in databases, but anyway, it's like a not a null kind of thing. So then we have the other part of philosophy, Indian philosophies, which is based on Nastika, which are the non-Vedic systems. They reject the Vedic authority. And the philosophies are Jainism, Buddhism, Ajvika, and Karvaka or Charvaka, depending on how you pronounce that. So these are, again, some philosophical things. Like, for example, this I talked about it long time ago in one of the ontology summits, where if you talk about the Jain philosophy is kind of interesting because it says like absolute knowledge could not properly be communicated using limited concepts. Okay, all claims should be seen as relative and provisional. So that means if you look at any object, there are multiple perspectives. Now, one of the things to do with the Indian philosophy is that for a particular truth, there are multiple perspectives. That's not a single perspective, as Aristotle kind of mentioned, but here you can have multiple perspectives. Like, for example, I can look at a tree and say there is some useful shade of shelter, one perspective. It could be good to climb, another perspective, useful timber, third perspective, it's a oak tree, fourth perspective, and so on and so forth. So each of the perspective is valid. It depends on the viewer as such. So that has to be, I think Jain philosophy talks about it quite a lot. So in any way, what happened is that, as we all know, we've been working on category theory. Here I make a comparison of the category theory and of all the ancient Indian philosophies. Okay, like for example, in the category theory, we have objects which are defined by morphisms, and that's very clearly defined in the Buddhist philosophy. Similarly, the functors, which is basically in the Nyaya logic, which we talked about, and it's the truth-preserving mappings of structure from one domain to another. And then you have the topos theory, which is the Jain philosophy talks about, where we just mentioned before, which is that truth is dependent on the specific standpoint. And then you have the categorical theory, which is in the Vaisheshika's Padarthas, where we talked about the formal categories and ontological structures. Okay, so what I'm going to do is that I thought I'll give 10-minute talk, just a little bit extended. So I'm going to stop at this stage and give it over to Gary.
Thank you, Ram. Do you want to take a question or two in case there's something from the audience?
Yeah, I can take two, and if depending on which one, I think we also have my colleague Subramaniam, who is probably can answer them too.
Anyone, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand.
And Robbie has his hand up.
Robbie.
Yeah, one quick comment. Excellent. Thank you, Ram. You have taken it primarily, you have taken primarily from Vedas onwards, namely the content of Vedas is as derived in these 6 philosophies that you described very well. And I just wanted to tell that there is a prehistory version which has a lot of science in it, and I have written an article which I will share someday with this forum, where I do discover things like particle physics. As you mentioned, Kanad, similar to that, there have been other rishis who have contemplated on things like ontologies in Vedas themselves and in terms of particles.
Yeah.
Up
So there's a
to
lot of stuff out
formation
there. I'm
of
just trying to synthesize a little bit here. Also, there's a good reference here. If you see on this particular slide, there's a guy named Ranganathan
Yes,
who developed this classification called colon classification.
yes,
Anyone interested in that, there are several papers in there, and I think this guy has done a very good mapping on the ancient Indian views of knowledge representation into the modern systems.
yes.
So this is a good reference, then people can look into it.
Till recently, most libraries adopted the Ranganathan classification.
Exactly.
But
It's
now,
better than this Dewey system. So the guy did a great job on that.
thank you.
In
Thank
fact,
you.
I just want to say that several standards, especially in process engineering, use Ranganathan style classification, what is called faceted classification, to provide multiple perspectives as well. So it has gotten infused in some of the standards making processes where they are actually identifying objects and processes, where the idea of facets and Ranganathan's idea have been implemented, especially in ISO 81346 and so on.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Sir.
I think because Sab and I have been thinking about this for some time. Thanks, Sab, for joining in. Sudarshan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a quick thought. Most often, if you see in the philosophy, the examples and things that you showed, is it related to only the macroscopic ideas of what objects are, or we are talking at the level of atoms and things? Because that is where the disconnect happens. The theory of small versus theory of large. Do you see any deeper thinking in that in Upanishads and Vedas? Because they have something on those.
Yeah. So if you look at this thing here, when you go to this Vaisheshika thing, if you look at that, if you go down to rightmost kind of thing where you have this paramanu, that's actually the atom. So the atom is the one which they talk about. They try to explain this at the atomic level, okay, and then combine this at the macro level. I mean, there are some attempts. I don't know too much. You probably know about it. If you want, if you can throw some light on that.
I'm just I looked at that in terms of the Pramanu, which I think I missed it before. But the issue is this, how you perceive a macro level objects
Yeah.
is different from what we cannot see.
Yeah, that's an interesting philosophical question too, because these guys at the time thought that that atoms are the smallest elements available, and then everything is combined by the atoms. And based on how these atoms are combined, your life then they try to explain that in terms of how each individual is made of these atoms and things like that, and what happens, and how the characteristics kind of go, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole lot of philosophy on that. And if people are interested, they should probably go to this Vaisheshika philosophy, which goes into much deeper things in there. So if you Google, you'll find out all about this in more detail. So that's a good question for Gemini to ask Sudarshan. Now we are running out of time, I guess, here.
I just make a quick remark. If you notice right from the beginning, this ontology is based on relationships and processes. Because you know that objects change their identity all the time. It is the processes and how those processes act on the objects is what is based on the notions of relationship.